question, as a matter of law, to Alan Dershowitz and the president's defenders, does it matter if there was a quid pro quo? Is it true that quid pro quos are often used in foreign policy? And they are often used in foreign policy, but not in order to achieve the president's personal political desired outcome. And that's the difference, of course. And in response to that, and this is perhaps the most striking thing that has been said all day, Alan Dershowitz, defending President Trump, said if the president does something which he believes will get him elected in the public interest, that cannot be the kind of quid pro quo that results in impeachment. So in other words, if it's being done for the quote-unquote public interest, and every single politician thinks everything they do,
whatever they do is in the
public interest, and like, of course, their re-election is in the public interest because they are great and their rivals are horrible, then that cannot be considered impeachable. And it's a remarkable statement, and it set off a bunch of questions, including what if Obama had done such a thing, and then there was a back and forth. But
Joyce Vance, because I follow you on Twitter, my phone was physically hot to the touch late tonight after the Dershowitz argument. Explain to the good folks what it is he argued at the risk of repetition and your view of it where it bumps up against actual law.
Well, this is what Karine is referencing. It's this notion Dershowitz now has, which I think is the full-blown expansion of Bill Barr, the Attorney General's expansive, powerful unitary executive. And this is its ultimate expression, that the president can do anything to get reelected if that's in the public interest. So when you're trying a jury case and the jury goes back to deliberate, the judge often reminds them that they don't have to leave their common sense at the door as they evaluate evidence. We're all now so deep down into the trees that we're not seeing the forest. But if we take a step back and use our common sense, arguments like Dershowitz's really fall apart. These people in the Republican Party are contorting themselves to find a way of justifying the president. And they're now saying things that we know if we use our common sense are ridiculous.
These are people that perhaps over the years have liked you and respected you. This crosses a line. Lockhart in particular crosses a line because really they're going to compare you to Hitler. They're going to go that far because you dared to have a different opinion based on really sound knowledge, the Constitution, our founders, our framers, and you laid it out, and they just hate the fact that they disagree with you, and I guess you were so effective.
Well, I think the reason they really came after me is they saw after I made my talk and after I answered those questions, many of the senators gathered around me, including Democrats, and they all said how they were impressed by my constitutional presentation. And remember that the point I was making was about the senators. What I said is, if you have mixed motives, if you are in the public interest and you're trying to help the public, but you're also trying to get reelected, according to Schiff and Nadler, that's a crime. If you have any inkling of motive to help yourself get reelected, they call that corrupt. And they say even a tiny amount of motive to help yourself makes you into a criminal and makes you impeachable. And I turned to all the senators and I said, everybody in this room, every senator, every politician, everywhere, always has one eye toward reelection, another eye toward the public interest. They almost always think it's the same. They also think their own election is in the public interest. You can't make that an impeachable offense. But I never, ever said or suggested or implied that a president can do anything he wants if he thinks his election will help the public interest. That was just a lie, a distortion, and it was stated by Schiff, it was stated by Nadler, it was stated by Schumer, it was stated by virtually everybody on CNN and MSNBC, and it was just categorically false.
Senator Cruz.
Mr. Chief Justice, I send a question to the desk.
The question is addressed to counsel for the president. As a matter of law, does it matter if there was a quid pro quo? Is it true that quid pro quos are often used in foreign policy?
Chief Justice, thank you very much for your question. Yesterday, I had the privilege of attending the rolling out of a peace plan by the President of the United States regarding the Israel-Palestine conflict. And I offered you a hypothetical the other day. What if a Democratic president were to be elected and Congress were to authorize much money to either Israel or the Palestinians, and the Democratic president were to say to Israel, no, I'm going to withhold this money unless you stop all settlement growth, or to the Palestinians, I will withhold the money Congress authorized to you unless you stop paying terrorists. And the president said, quid pro quo. If you don't do it, you don't get the money. If you do it, you get the money. There's no one in this chamber that would regard that as in any way unlawful. The only thing that would make a quid pro quo unlawful is if the quo were in some way illegal. Now, we talked about motive. There are three possible motives that a political figure can have. One, a motive in the public interest, and the Israel argument would be in the public interest. The second is in his own political interest, and the third, which hasn't been mentioned, would be in his own financial interest, his own pure financial interest, just putting money in the bank. I want to focus on the second one for just one moment. Every public official that I know believes that his election is in the public interest. And mostly you're right. Your election is in the public interest. And if a president does something which he believes will help him get elected in the public interest, that cannot be the kind of quid pro quo that results in impeachment. I quoted President Lincoln. When President Lincoln told General Sherman to let the troops go to Indiana so that they can vote for the Republican Party. Let's assume the president was running at that point, and it was in his electoral interest to have these soldiers put at risk the lives of many, many other soldiers who would be left without their company. Would that be an unlawful quid pro quo? No, because the president, A, believed it was in the national interest, but B, he believed that his own election was essential to victory in the Civil War. Every president believes that. That's why it's so dangerous to try to psychoanalyze a president, to try to get into the intricacies of the human mind. Everybody has mixed motives. And for there to be a constitutional impeachment based on mixed motives would permit almost any president to be impeached. How many presidents have made foreign policy decisions after checking with their political advisors and their pollsters? If you're just acting in the national interest, what do you need pollsters? What do you need political advisors? Just do what's best for the country. But if you want to balance what's in the public interest with what's in your party's electoral interest and your own electoral interest, it's impossible to discern how much weight is given to one to the other. Now, we may argue that it's not in the national interest for a particular president to get reelected or for a particular senator or member of Congress. And maybe we're right. It's not in the national interest for everybody who's running to be elected. But for it to be impeachable, you would have to discern that he or she made a decision solely on the basis of, as the House managers put it, corrupt motives. And it cannot be a corrupt motive if you have a mixed motive that partially involves the national interest, partially involves electoral, and does not involve personal pecuniary interests. And the House managers do not allege that this decision, this quid pro quo, as they call it, and the question is based on the hypothesis there was a quid pro quo, I'm not acting the facts, they never allege that it was based on pure financial reasons. It would be a much harder case if a hypothetical president of the United States said to a hypothetical leader of a foreign country, unless you build a hotel with my name on it, and unless you give me $1 million kickback, I will withhold the funds. That's an easy case. That's purely corrupt and in the purely private interest. But a complex middle case is, I want to be elected. I think I'm a great president. I think I'm the greatest president there ever was. And if I'm not elected, the national interest will suffer greatly. That cannot be an impeachable offense. Thank you, Mr. Chief Justice.
Recognize the Democratic leader.
Mr. Chief Justice, I send a question to the desk.
The question is for the House managers. Would you please respond to the answer that was just given by the President's counsel?
I would be delighted. There are two arguments that Professor Dershowitz makes. One that is, I have to say, a very odd argument for a criminal defense lawyer to make, and that is, it is highly unusual to have a discussion in a trial about the defendant's state of mind, intent, or mens rea. In every courtroom in America, in every criminal case, or almost every criminal case, except for a very small sliver that are strict liability, the question of the defendant's intent and state of mind is always an issue. So this is nothing novel here. You don't require a mind reader. In every criminal case, and I would assume in every impeachment case, yes, you have to show that the president was operating from a corrupt motive, and we have. But he also makes an argument that all quid pro quos are the same and all are perfectly copacetic. Now, some of you said earlier, well, if they could prove a quid pro quo over the military, now that would be something. Well, we have. So now the argument shifts to all quid pro quos are just fine, they're all the same. Well, I'm going to apply Professor Dershowitz's own test. He talked about the step test. John Rawls, the philosopher. Let's put the shoe on the other foot and see how that changes our perception of things. But I want to merge that argument with one of the other presidential counsel's argument when they resorted to the whataboutism about Barack Obama's open mic. Now, that was a very poor analogy, I think you'll agree, but let's use that analogy and let's make it more comparable to today and see how you feel about this scenario. President Obama, on an open mic, says to Medvedev, "Hey, Medvedev, I know you don't want me to send this military money to Ukraine because they're fighting and killing your people. I want you to do me a favor, though. I want you to do an investigation of Mitt Romney. And I want you to announce you found dirt on Mitt Romney. And if you're willing to do that, quid pro quo, I won't give Ukraine the money they need to fight you on the front line." Do any of us have any question that Barack Obama would be impeached for that kind of misconduct? Are we really ready to say that that would be okay if Barack Obama asked Medvedev to investigate his opponent and would withhold money from an ally that it needed to defend itself to get an investigation of Mitt Romney? That's the parallel here. And to say, well, yes, we condition aid all the time, for legitimate reasons, yes. For legitimate reasons, you might say to a governor of a state, hey, governor of a state, you should chip in more towards your own disaster relief. But if the president's real motive in depriving a state of disaster relief is because that governor won't get his attorney general to investigate the president's political rival, are we ready to say that the president can sacrifice the interests of the people of that state, or in the case of Medvedev, the people of our country, because all quid pro quos are fine, it's carte blanche? Is that really what we're prepared to say with respect to this president's conduct or the next? Because if we are, then the next president of the United States can ask for an investigation of you. They can ask for help in their next election from any foreign power. And the argument will be made, nope, Donald Trump was acquitted for doing exactly the same thing, therefore it must not be impeachable. Now, bear in mind that efforts to cheat an election are always going to be in proximity to an election. And if you say you can't hold a president accountable in an election year where they're trying to cheat in that election, then you are giving them carte blanche. So all quid pros are not the same. Some are legitimate and some are corrupt, and you don't need to be a mind reader to figure out which is which. For one thing, you can ask John Bolton.
Thank you, Mr. Manager.